Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk to you about Shirley Jackson and the lottery. So we'll talk a bit about foreshadowing in the story, but mainly we're going to look at thematic elements in the story, symbolism, and the irony that Shirley Jackson uses. So, Shirley Jackson, a little bit about her. Uh, this is her, and she was considered something, she considered herself something of an outcast or social victim. A lot of her writing was about that. So you can see she lived 1919 to 1965, and she's known as a horror writer. If anybody watched that recent Netflix show, The Haunting of Hill House, that's actually about it's an adaptation of one of her novels, and so a lot of her stories have this kind of disturbing element to them. They're often about ordinary people, and terrible things are happening to them. Uh, After college, she was put in a mental institution. A lot of her writing is about the psychology, the psychological situations that characters are put into. After she was released, she married an intellectual, and he kind of encouraged her to become this writer who thought outside of the box, kind of a free thinker. Uh, and, he encouraged her bad habits as well. And she ended up dying pretty young because she smoked too much and she ate too much, and she would pop pills. So she didn't really live a healthy lifestyle. When her husband got a job working in higher education in Vermont, she moved with him to this little town, North Bennington, Vermont. And a lot of people think that this little village is what the village in the lottery was based on. It's a little insular village where people, were kind of old-fashioned and weren't really forward thinking. And she was, as a Jew, as an intellectual, she felt like an outsider in that village, like people didn't understand her. She was a nonconformist, and being a conformist or conformity is definitely a major idea that gets brought up in the story, The Lottery. She used to she used to defend her children. She was like the mom that you didn't want to deal with at the PTA meeting, because if she felt people were being narrow-minded or unfair with her children, who were she thought, of course, brilliant, then she would blame it on their being backwards in this backwards little village. Uh, little briefly about the lottery, she published this story in the New Yorker, and it got more hate mail than any story had ever gotten before at the New Yorker, to where they didn't know what to do with all of the angry letters. They just ended up mailing it to Shirley Jackson. And the people in the village of North Bennington didn't know that she had written this story for a long time, because they're not readers of the New Yorker. But eventually they found out about it, and yeah, they resented the way they thought she was depicting them in the village as being backwards, or not having a strong sense of right and wrong. So let's move on to the story. There is foreshadowing in the story. Something that I have talked about before is foreshadowing is not necessarily the best thing to focus on when you are trying to interpret a story for its deeper meaning, for its theme. A lot of students end up focusing one whole part of their essay on how a writer uses foreshadowing, but it doesn't really help them to make their point about what the story's deeper meaning is, so don't fall into that trap. But there is foreshadowing here in the story. The children are gathering stones in the beginning. You don't know what that's about. Maybe you think they're going to skip some stones. There's this sense of hesitation in the story, where people didn't want to, they don't want to do certain things. They hesitate before speaking up or volunteering information when everyone's gathering at the square, and you don't really understand it at first why people are hesitating. They're there for a lottery. It sounds like a lovely thing, right? But as the story progresses, you see that these are hints that it is not a positive thing they're gathering for. And you can see this in their nervousness as well. Everyone seems to be nervous. I'm going to pull the story up here, and you can see here. Let's just, something you can do on a PDF is you can just oops. you can just search for anytime the word nervous gets used, and you see here the tall boy who's drawing for his mother and me, he blinks nervously. Why is he nervous? I thought the lottery was a cool thing and they all want to be there, but no. You can see Mr. Summers is talking to Mr. Adams here. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Why? At first maybe you think, oh, he's nervous because he's in front of a lot of people, but as it keeps saying that people are nervous, you start to think maybe there's something else going on here. They get the small papers in their hands and they're turning them over and over nervously. Why is everyone so nervous? So you might argue, here, don't be nervous, Jack, Mr. Summers says. Take your time, son. So you could argue that these hints that these are hints that what's going on here is not a great thing, is going to be a negative thing because of how nervous they are. And graveness as well. There's a character named Mr. Graves and his wife Mrs. Graves, and of course when you hear that you think death, Graves, right? So just using the names Graves in this story seems to hint at death is coming in the story, but also they say things gravely. And that means seriously or solemnly. So why is everyone so serious if they're gathering in the square for something nice to do, the lottery? But suspense starts to build, and when Tessie Hutchinson starts to protest and say, no, it's unfair, then you're definitely saying, no, there's something wrong here. Symbolism in the story, we have the black box is the clearest symbol. And here we start to see a clear development of a theme. You see the original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. Here she's saying, what does the black box represent? It represents tradition. She's actually telling you the black box is a symbol for tradition. And so if the black box represents tradition, you see this is a tradition that the village has. It has evolved out of an older tradition, right? It has changed, but... and he goes on to talk about the different ways it has changed. They used to have a chant. They used to stand a certain way. There used to be more specific rituals to it, right? But the one thing they didn't change is the stones. They knew that it says that at the end. The one thing they didn't change was the fact that they stoned someone to death at the end. So if the black box represents tradition, what is Shirley Jackson saying about tradition? This will get to your interpretation of the story. Every year after the lottery, they talk about getting a new box, a new tradition, but every year it was allowed to fade off without anything's being done. So they talk about changing tradition, but they never change tradition. You have... the stones, these might be symbolic of some idea. When you think about someone being stoned, a lot of times you think about the Bible, the story of the woman who was being stoned, and Jesus said, let you who is without sin cast the first stone, right? And then no one stoned the woman. Well, here is anyone without sin. Maybe the children, you might say, and they were gathering the stones. Were they the first people to cast stones? Actually, if the children are without sin here because they've just been indoctrinated, they've been told this is normal, well, then surely the adults were also raised to believe this was normal, right? So is anyone at fault for murdering people in this way, or is it tradition to blame? It brings up these ideas. And then there's the black spot that's on the paper. Some people have suggested that's like having a black mark on your record, like a black spot on your character, like it represents sin or guilt. So themes, these aren't total themes. To have a theme, you would have to make an actual statement about what she was saying about tradition. So if you were saying, if her theme is about tradition, what is she saying about tradition, right? The black box represents tradition. What is she saying about tradition? Well, when people blindly follow tradition, evil might persist, something like that, and you might have an actual theme that you can express, something to do with ritual and propriety, because you can see here where it's talking about there's a great deal of fussing to be done. There were lists to make. Let's see here. Chips of wood. It's talking about how things have changed. At one time, people remember there had been a recital of some sort, a tuneless chant, and they said it was proper to give this a salute, right? So they're talking about what's proper and what rituals need to be followed. These kind of all go into the idea of tradition. But then we get other ideas about hierarchy. You have Mr. Summers, who's seems to be above other people, right? You have is he really he takes a drawing, but you wonder if it's fixed, if he really has as much of a chance as everyone else. There's this idea of the fear of change or progress. Old Man Warner talks about people who are thinking about getting rid of the lottery. And how he thinks that will lead to nothing good, right? How it'll just be, they'll go back to living in caves. And he says it's young people. He says it's those young people who aren't conforming to traditions that they get these crazy ideas in their heads. So these are all topics that you might touch on in trying to express some argument about the theme of this story. So she does use irony in this story. Remember, an irony is a contrast between what's stated, what's really meant, or usually in a story it's between what you expect to happen and what actually does happen. In this story, we have the word lottery. You think it's a positive thing, right? But you think it has to do, you get lucky if you win the lottery and you're going to be happy for the rest of your life. But in this case, no. Ironically, here it's the opposite. And you think about drawing, having a drawing, that's usually something that's considered fair. We don't want to do it, let's have a drawing. But Tessie is calling it unfair the whole time. So there are these elements of an unexpected twist on what's happening. She creates a misleading atmosphere. So an atmosphere is an emotional tone that the writer creates through description and word choice. And she makes you think it's a nice day here with the pleasant weather, people that are happy. They're looking forward to having lunch after the lottery, which is really dark when you consider, that they're actually about to kill someone. But so ironically, it's there here for something that's very unpleasant, and she lulls you into thinking that it's a nice thing in order to shock you toward the end, right? Maybe to shock you with what she's trying to show you, which would be her theme, right? What her intentions were. So the atmosphere doesn't really foreshadow the violent public execution, so it's kind of misleading. So these are some of the elements that people often analyze in the story. What you would, if you chose to write about this story, the most important thing is for you to try to create a coherent argument about what you think the deeper meaning of the story is, which means maybe you look at that those symbols and those topics for themes, those thematic topics, and try to state something about conformity or about a tradition. What about tradition, though? What is she saying about tradition? What is she saying about conformity or non-conformity? What is she saying about being afraid to change, right? If you answer a question like that, then you might get at a clear interpretation of what you're saying the story means.